So I am Joel Bernosky. I am from the New York State Department of Health. I work for the Source Water Protection Program. I'll be giving you guys a little presentation today that we're giving to some partners around the state. Joining me in this presentation is my colleague from New York State DEC, Kristin Martinez. She'll be giving the second half of the presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the Source Water Protection Program as has been going on since about 2017. And then I will turn it over to Kristin to give a little bit more context with the program from the state's angle, and then we will open it up to questions afterwards. So thank you, Joanna, for inviting me to give this presentation. I actually used to be a part of this group, so it's great to be back. It's interesting to be doing this virtually instead of being at the Fire Training Center in Cheektowaga. That was always a fun place. So I can just jump right into the presentation. So source water protection in New York, it began in the 1880s, and it's taken various steps and different shapes throughout its history. In 1996, the US Congress amended the Safe Drinking Water Act and added the Source Water Assessment Program. If you've heard of SWAPs, that's what we're talking about. So those required every state in the country to evaluate the sources of their public drinking water systems. We're probably all aware that the SWAPs were imperfect. They were a product that is still an important tool for communities, but we are very well aware that they were an imperfect solution for going forward in time. The SWAP efforts from the early 2000s that you may be familiar with were the last state-led source water protection initiative until April of 2017. That's when Governor Cuomo signed the Clean Water Infrastructure Act, CWIA, which allocated $3 million to the Environmental Protection Fund for source water in each of the last 3 budgets. That would have been 2017, 2018, and 2019. I actually just got the budget bill that the governor proposed yesterday, and I have not gone through it yet. So please no spoilers to the amount that is in the new budget for this program. Unlike the SWAPs, the Drinking Water Source Protection Program, or DWSP2, you'll see that acronym quite a lot going forward. It's not led by a single agency, it's a collaboration. So this collaboration is 4 agencies in the state: New York State DOH, New York State DEC, Department of State, and Agriculture and Markets. So shortly after the bill was signed by the governor, a multidisciplinary stakeholder group was established, and that really set the formulation of the vision for what the Drinking Water Source Protection Program was going to be. Everyone on this group, I actually have a list here, I can read it: American Water Works Association, the Business Council, New York Association of Regional Councils, New York Association of Towns, New York Association of County Planning Directors, the New York Association of Counties, bear with me, the New York State Soil and Water Conservation Committees, Hudson Riverkeeper, and the New York Rural Water Association. That brings me to slide 2. So the DWSP2 is really envisioned as the next step in focusing on source water protection. The original SWAPs were really about defining pollution sources, and this is more focused on what are those protection aspects that we can all engage in. So that multidisciplinary group highlighted the need to not only update those SWAPs, but to push for the implementation of identified source water protection projects. So the effort from the early 2000s was a step in the right direction, but it fell short. There was really no programmatic support for implementation and no real engagement on the local level. So the SWAPs were something that were produced and then, while useful in some contexts, they weren't really followed up with. They were, put on the shelf and not really engaged with at the local level. So the DWSP2 has made that ground level community involvement and partnership building into its main focus. We think that this is the key to protecting source water across the state and really opening up that next phase of community involvement in the process. So I am going to quickly walk you through the framework that we've developed as a multidisciplinary, multi-agency, multi-stakeholder kind of consortium. The framework was developed over the last couple of years. It's actually available on our website and DEC's website if anybody wants to dive into the nitty-gritty of it. But this slide shows the overall breakdown of the framework, and I'll just walk you through the general headings that you see in bold here and a little bit of context. So, excuse me, the stakeholder group is number one there. That is what establishes the goals and vision for the program. This helps align the priorities and the resources in the source water protection program. The long-term success is really dependent on that acceptance and buy-in from key stakeholders. So this isn't something that agencies like DOH or DEC are just going to do and hand over to the community. Having the community in, that's, most of you guys on the call, is really the key part. Without that local involvement and buy-in, none of this works. So that's why it's number one. Definitely really important to identify who might be interested in source water protection in your communities and get them involved early on. Next, the drinking water assessment, number two there. Based on conversations from the last couple of years, source water protection has been updated in piecemeal ways around the state. Down in Long Island, there were some consultants working on it. In some of the other regions, county planning boards were working on source water protection. Some local governments and some nonprofit groups are working on it, again, in like a piecemeal kind of way. So we imagine that different regions around the state have different, trying to think of a good way to explain this. They've made different progress on source water protection. So an area like Western New York, where watershed management plans are being drafted, maybe further ahead than a community who hasn't begun any source water protection planning yet. So this step, number two, is kind of flexible. We imagine that this might be necessary, not necessary for every community. We know that delineations of source water protection areas and things like open space acquisition are ongoing processes, and the various inputs from local municipalities might be a little bit more flexible with this second drinking water assessment portion. So for communities that haven't done updated assessments and don't have things like watershed management plans or updated contribution areas, identifying potential contaminant areas and identification of protection methods is the next big step. So that's number three here on our list. The framework, if you go into it, and I'll point you to the PDF after this presentation, it lists both regulatory and non-regulatory protection methods. So each contaminant source in the framework has its own set of management methods. That could be anything like working with your local health department on MCL violations for drinking water source issues, or working to acquire land around a drinking water well. So again, this will be a ground level process that the community is involved in, identifying which types of contaminants are in a system of concern and how you want to implement fixing them. So the fourth one kind of like wraps all this up. So you're identifying your contaminants, you're identifying ways to address your contaminants or protection strategies if there aren't contaminants of concern. And it's designating a plan management team for an implementation timeline. This is one of the most crucial parts of implementing the plan. Without a timeline, some of these goals don't get done. One of the things we've seen, again, going back to the swaps from the early 2000s, is you can identify all your concerns and identify how you want to fix them. But if you don't lay out a way that you're going to implement, you're probably not going to be rushing to get them done. So that's a huge step and a big part of the program. The final component is establishing a plan management team. This is the team that is accountable for implementing. Again, it needs to be ground level. It needs to be stakeholder driven. You know, if you are looking to implement your source water protection strategy, somebody needs to be accountable for that. So that is the final part of our framework. And again, that's really the thing that drives the strategies and the implementation of the source water protection plan. So each protection plan for every community, they're all going to be different. All the goals identified are going to be different. We understand that a one-size-fits-all approach will not work for source water protection. And we really hope that communities are able to be in the driver's seat of these plans and be able to revisit them. Again, this isn't something that is going to be done and put up on a shelf. It's something that's going to be a living document that's revised and revisited from time to time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kristin, and she's going to walk you through the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Joel. So moving to a little bit more on where we are now, as Joel mentioned, our draft framework is publicly available on DEC's website. You can find that using this link you see here, or by searching just in a browser, typing in DWSB2. It should also pull up our webpage. A little bit more on the framework. So Joel just went through all of the framework components. The way we have set up the framework is the first 10 pages or so of that document pretty much guide the community through all of those components and what should be included in a protection plan. And the remaining 130 plus pages or so of that document is what we call a resource kit. So it basically provides resources for each component of the framework, tools, links. Some of them are worksheets that can aid a community to complete that component. We have had this available on our website for a little more than a year now. And also recently, last fall, we also added some supplemental tools that we thought could aid a community as they go through the framework. One of those is a data summary. So this tool is in Excel or a Word version. We did because we found some communities may prefer one or the other. And what the data summary will do is, as a community is going through the framework and they are collecting and gathering all this information, it provides them a place to store all of that in one file with a tab for each of the components. We thought that could be helpful for communities as they go through this program. The second resource is actually a DWSB2 plan template. So in addition to the framework and data summary, we thought it would be useful for the community to have something that will actually wind up being their protection plan, their written document. So the template, again, it goes through all the components, they all align with each other, and basically states, this is information that you might want to include in this section of your report. Those two new resources are also included on the DEC's website. So now that we have the framework and the resources available, just like this slide says, our goal is to field test this document. So we are accepting feedback from technical assistance providers and a few stakeholders that we worked with earlier to actually create the framework. So we have 5 types of technical assistance providers, all free of charge, to help communities develop and implement their unique and individual source water protection program plans. All of these providers will be using the framework to create these plans. And they are giving DEC and DOH regular feedback on the process and resources in the framework. We have been having quarterly meetings with these technical assistance providers because this is a working draft. We really value their feedback to improve and eventually have a final version. So the first you see here is the state hired consultants. DEC and DOH through Office of General Services have hired 2 consultants. Those consultants are Barton and LaJudice and Chazen. They will be working with up to 30 volunteer municipalities to use the framework and develop these protection plans. Right now, DEC and DOH are in the process of negotiating these work orders with the consultants. The second technical assistance provider you see here is through DEC. DEC has 2 drinking water source protection staff that will be providing technical assistance to municipalities. They anticipate working with 2 communities in early this year. And again, same as the state hired consultant, they will be using that framework when they're working with those communities. The third you see on this slide is through Department of Health. So they have 8 regional staff spread all across the state to assist communities with developing and implementing those plans. DOH staff in each region are working on a prioritization list to identify communities that they will be working with. They are reviewing this process internally, and following review and approval, they're going to start working with communities. Next is regional planning boards. So 9 regional planning boards applied to DEC's 604B grant and received funding to assist communities with these DWSP2 plans. Each planning board has identified a community, and they are currently working with those communities to develop a plan. These contracts are 4 years long. They're about in the middle of those contracts right now, so they will be working with additional communities throughout their contract term. The last on this slide is through New York Rural Water Association. Steve Winkley, he was actually a part of our stakeholder group when we were developing the statewide program and the framework and quite a few of the resources. He has been writing source water protection plans for communities across the state for over 25 years. He is going to be incorporating the steps of the framework into his existing source water protection plans. And he is also actively working with communities on source water planning. One thing we also wanted to highlight, we did write this framework in a way for a community to pick this up and use it on their own if they choose to. But we also have, as you see, a number of technical assistance providers available if they would like to work with one. And then right now, I think we're just going to open it up to questions that anyone might have about the program or any of the items mentioned.
Thanks, Kristin and Joel. I have a quick question. If communities are interested in looking into this further, should they contact one of you? Should they look at the framework first? What would be the next step?
Yeah, so feel free to contact either Kristin or myself. You can also go through your local health department. So that would be, in this case, the Erie County Department of Health. They would coordinate with our regional DOH team. That would be me. Wade, who is on the line, is a field coordinator for DOH. Feel free to also take a look at the framework yourself. It is, it's pretty in-depth. It is way more user-friendly than it probably appears at first glance, but there might be enough information in that to, bring it to people in your community and get started on the process. But again, we're always open to talk about this. We have teams working across the entire state on this process, and we're more than happy to answer any questions or steer you in the right direction of any technical assistance you might need.